Listen up, Grunts. I'm only going to say this once. I'm your poetry teacher. Yeah, laugh it up, they all do the first time. Poetry teacher. We want to learn to fight. Well, shut your damn mouths and listen. If you want to be a stupid beast, whacking your enemy with a club, then walk right out that door. Our Lord in Iron is the god of war. Not just fighting or slaughter, but war. And war isn't just killing till you run out of the other side. It has a rhythm to it, a beat. A good warrior learns it, a bad one dies. So clean out your ears and get ready to listen, because I do not like to repeat myself. Ulfric Earlson, Gormite Skald, instructing military officers in Taldor. Greetings, Pathfinders, and welcome back to the Absalom Archives Religion. If you want peace, you must prepare for war, and that's exactly what we'll be doing today with our first deific deep dive into Gorum, our Lord in Iron, god of battle, strength, and weapons. Historical alignment, chaotic neutral. Domains, confidence, destruction, might, zeal. Historical domains, chaos, glory, strength, war. Historical subdomains, blood, duels, ferocity, protean, rage, resolve, tactics. Favored weapon, the greatsword. Favored animal, the rhino. Edicts, attain victory in fair combat, push your limits, wear armor in combat. Anathema, kill prisoners or surrendering foes, prevent conflict through negotiation, win a battle through underhanded tactics or indirect magic. History and mythology. Where there is battle, there is Gorum. Where there is war, there is Gorum. Where there is conflict, strife, bloodshed, and combat, there is Gorum. These are where our Lord in Iron lives and has always lived. There's very little information about Gorum's early history. The Windsong Testament claims he worked with Torag and Pharasma to build the Dread Vault, Gorum being one of the few gods capable of assisting in forging Rovagug's prison. After this, his history on Golarion is relatively quiet, which is funny because war is one of those things you assume is just kinda always around, but throughout the Age of Serpents and the Age of Legends, we have little to no record of widespread Gorum worship. The ancient Aslanti, the peoples of Tian Sha, the residents of the Mwangi Expanse, none of their histories mention our Lord in Iron. Some of that you can probably chalk up to those cultures having their own appropriate war gods, whose edicts and worship are more aligned with their cultural values. Perhaps the people of distant continents like Arcadia, Kazmaran, or Sarusan worshipped him in some capacity, but if they did, we don't know about it. What we do know is that Gorum's worship returned with gusto during the Age of Darkness, when the orcs emerged from the Darklands ahead of the dwarves. Seeking to find a new home for themselves on the surface, the orcs battled the remnants of humanity in several conflicts. Some legends say that this is Gorum's true birth, as the blood spilled between orc and human armies pooled into the scraps of armor and weapons discarded by the Fallen. The fury and bloodshed washed over these pieces, and the sparks from clashing metal lit a fire under them. From this crucible, Gorum emerged, honed to a razor's edge and ready to wade into any conflict. Which of these is true? Well, other sources do seem to confirm Gorum's assistance in Rovagug's imprisonment, so it's gotta be that one, right? Well, yeah, from a certain point of view it is. However, it's important to remember that gods are not mortals. Their existence and history is more fluid. Some dead gods still grant powers, some gods fade with time or change their ways as the cultures that worship them progress. Thinking about mythology for a moment, is being born twice really even that weird? It's possible that between making Rovagug's prison and the Age of Darkness, Gorum was just dormant or missing. His modern followers speculate that a world without war makes Gorum fade away, so that could be possible. When the Age of Serpents ended, Aslant became the dominant power in most of the world. Calling that time peaceful is maybe a bit of a stretch, but the large-scale conflict Gorum prefers was far less prominent. Another possibility, and my personal theory, is that Gorum was simply occupied elsewhere. A god like Gorum, whose purview is so broad, isn't bound to a single planet. He spans all of creation. If Golarion was too, for lack of a better word, peaceful for his liking, Gorum could simply look somewhere else. Other planets in the very same solar system support life, and Gorum could have been worshipped more prominently on any of them. And if not there are any number of worlds throughout the cosmos. Until the Age of Darkness changed things, these places were likely just more interesting to the war god. If this theory is true, what drew Gorum back to Golarion was likely the mass upheaval caused by the Starstone's impact and the centuries of strife and conflict that followed. The battle between the orcs and the human forces were fought by desperate people eager to survive an apocalypse. Gorum's philosophies about strength and battle prowess would have resonated with both sides. Ironically, it might have been the one unifying element between the two cultures. Too bad that unifying element was also what encouraged them to keep fighting each other, but that's a whole different can of worms. With this perspective on things, it makes a lot of sense that Dromar, who are most commonly born from orc and human parents, would venerate the god who bridged their cultures in this sense. Whatever the truth might actually be, in the centuries since, worship of Gorum has become fairly common throughout the Inner Sea region. Many famous warriors have claimed to see visions of Gorum when they struck down their foes, but our Lord in Iron rarely intervenes directly in the mortal world. The closest story we have to that involves an oracle of Gorum. This oracle was approached by a legendary hero named Strada, who had been tasked with conquering an invincible city. The unnamed oracle provided Strada with dragon's teeth from a dragon named Cathalphas. Strada planted these teeth into the ground, where they sprouted into undead warriors called Spartoi, who helped him take the city. In addition to being a clear reference to a real-world Greek myth, this story also highlights Gorum's approach to helping his followers. Provide tools, but don't fight their battles for them. His followers are well aware of this as they march into battle. Everyone wants Gorum's favor to fall on their side, but they know they have to earn it. Gorum won't simply make you win. The complacent, who believe Gorum is always on their side, will learn quickly that their opponents also know of our Lord in Iron too, and they can pray just as hard. Description: something that helps Gorum fit on any side of a conflict is his appearance. He looks like a spiked suit of plate armor, battle-worn but well-maintained. The only thing visible from under his helmet are two red points of light. These are Gorum's eyes, burning with bloodlust. What else might exist under that armor is a mystery. Anyone that may have seen beneath has not lived to tell the tale. This doesn't stop many cultures from claiming that Gorum's true form is one of their own, though. The Dromar we've talked about, they see him as being born from orc and human conflict just like them. Certain human warrior cultures claim he's one of them as well, most notably the Kelids. His presence in orc culture is an interesting one. The orcs have their own pantheon of deities who rose to godhood through various means, but Gorum is sometimes worshipped as an over-deity of sorts. This is by no means universal, but it does highlight something kind of interesting. Many orcs believe that anything with a name and a face is ultimately mortal enough to be killed. Gorum may have a name, but he is as faceless as they come, meaning some orcs may consider him more godly than their own gods, who they often seek to challenge and replace as a show of strength and prowess. Gorum's own opinion on this issue is indifference. In a way, these worshippers are all correct, because Gorum is war and true war does not discriminate. It embraces all people, no matter age, gender, ancestry, or any other identifier. Gorum is all and is none. He is the champion and the enemy. He is every combatant on every side. When two warriors swing their weapons to take each other's life in battle, both are equally Gorum. Just make sure to temper your curiosity. Speculating about what's under Gorum's armor is acceptable as a thought exercise. Actually attempting to get a look, well, there's easier ways to get your soul obliterated if you're really into that. Divine Realm. Now you might guess that Gorum, as a god that enjoys the chaotic mess of war, would be a perfect fit for the Maelstrom. And you'd be close to right. Gorum's realm exists on the edge of Elysium, where it meets the waters of the Maelstrom. Called the Clashing Shore, this place is littered with eternal fortresses and blood-soaked battlefields. Here Gorum's faithful fight endlessly, their keeps restored each day at dawn no matter how battered and beaten they were the previous day. Who they are fighting changes constantly. Sometimes it's each other, sometimes it's the monsters of the Maelstrom, sometimes it's invading fiends. It doesn't really matter. Gorum himself stalks these battlefields forever, going where the fighting is thickest. Valkyries dot the skies, dropping off souls of the worthy to the endless fight. The Clashing Shore has a clearly marked border in Elysium, where several inscribed stones can be found. Each is impaled with a blade clearly made by the Azadas of Elysium and inscribed in several languages, all bearing the same message. It reads, "Thus the pledge is sealed, and thus you are accepted. Forever with our thanks, come what may." Whatever deal or favor Gorum may have done in the past is no longer known, at least not to mortals, but it has provided Gorum a place to wage his endless battle. Beliefs, Philosophies, and Aphorisms. Now that we know Gorum's divine realm, history, and physical description, it's time to move on to the philosophies, beliefs, and forms of worship about him. Something you might have picked up on by now is that Gorum's stance on war is somewhat apolitical. Why a war is happening is largely irrelevant. What's important to Gorum is how you conduct war. When you break it down, there are two broad ways this manifests, and I'm going to call them Gorum's ideal conflict and Gorum's code of conduct. These are my terms, not something the game ever actually uses. Gorum's ideal conflict represents what he enjoys most, for lack of a better term, about war. Gorum himself is a frontline fighter, the kind who leads the charge and wades into the thickest fighting. Directing troops from a command tent or sitting back with the artillery just doesn't suit him. It's not that he doesn't understand the value of those things, he's not an idiot, he just prefers direct confrontation more. He takes a similar view of things like clever ambushes and traps. The way I see it, Gorum accepts a kind of symmetrical fairness to these things. The opposing side had the same opportunity to scout for traps and see through tactics that your side did. If they wound up falling for an ambush, skill issue. If you can't rally and recover to win the day, you simply weren't strong enough. One basic setback shouldn't be enough to put you down. But Gorum does have lines, tactics that he won't embrace to win at any cost, and that brings us to Gorum's code of conduct. Think of these like divinely defined war crimes. Things like employing poison or assassination, malicious deception, or large-scale magic. Let me give you an example to kind of show where the line is drawn. Dressing up scarecrows like soldiers to make your walls seem more defended than they are and trick an opponent into wasting resources by shooting at them? That's perfectly fine. Feigning surrender so an opponent will make camp in your walls, then putting them to the sword while they sleep? Absolutely not. The consistent theme is honestly pretty simple. Gorum doesn't demand a fair fight, but he does demand that there be a fight. Anything that would completely circumvent that is against his principles. This doesn't just apply to what we think of as dirty tactics like poison or deception, but also to peaceful solutions like diplomatic negotiation. Gorumites settle things through combat, not words. And settle is an appropriate word to use because once combat has ended, things shift a bit. Surrender is a valid way to end things, and surrendered foes are to be treated fairly and honorably. Executing unarmed prisoners isn't battle, it's murder, and Gorum views it quite harshly. On the flip side, surrendered fighters are expected to behave themselves within reason. This all highlights the almost contradictory nuance to Gorum's faith. War is a chaotic and messy thing. You don't always have time or information to make proper informed decisions. And in the heat of combat, a second delay can mean death. As with every aspect of war, Gorum understands this. The deliberate actions of someone clear-headed, taken after everything is settled and you do have time to consider, are what earn Gorum's harsher judgments. Actions taken in the heat of the moment, without time to consider, even if they are a little dishonorable, will be treated with a little bit more leniency as well. There are a few common aphorisms in the faith that sum this all up pretty well, which we'll go over now in no particular order, along with a couple of common sayings Gorumites might use among themselves. Better to die a fighter than live a coward. Battle isn't easy and victory isn't guaranteed. You just might die. A Gorumite knows this and won't shirk away from a fight just because it's not a sure thing. This doesn't mean being suicidally stupid, you don't have to throw your life away for nothing, but if there's a chance to win, you're expected to try and take it. This fits nicely with our next saying, cowards flee, warriors retreat. No one wins every battle. You can do everything right and still lose. Backing off to reassess or regroup is fine. Even surrender is acceptable in the case of a clear defeat. Lives have value, and Gorum does not expect that value to be wasted on reckless bravado and lost causes. It's the difference between screw this, I'm out of here, and we will return to fight another day. Which brings us to an important question. Will you fight? It's a simple question, but perhaps the most important one. When the battle comes, will you fight? Will you risk death and defeat for the chance to gain victory? That battle can take many forms, from a literal one to a personal test of courage, but the question is always the same. Will you fight? And if you do, will you be ready? Blood, not rust. This is a pretty simple saying. Gorum teaches that a fighter should always keep their armor and weapons in good condition, clean and ready for use. If your armor must be dirty, let it be dirty with the blood of your enemies, not the rust of neglect. Iron-tongued. This last one's a little different. It's more like a title a Gorumite might acquire, similar to calling a smooth talker silver-tongued. But instead of being a charmer that can talk their way out of a fight, someone who's iron-tongued always knows just what to say to get themselves into a fight. In every field, there is an expert. Now, sayings are all well and good, but what about the more formal church teachings you'd expect from any god? Well, for that, we move on to our next section where we'll take a look at holy text, art, and worship. So all those tenets and philosophies we just went over are the kind of thing you'd expect to find in Gorum's holy text. But here's the thing, Gorum doesn't have one. He has 7, but also none at all. Instead of a single work, the Gorum's Kagat is a collection of 7 epic poems considered sacred by Gorum's church. Learning and reciting these is an important part of a cleric's education. This may seem a little random at first glance. Gorum is a brutal war god, and poetry is an art for soft-hearted romantics. But remember, these are epic poems, the kind that sing about kings of old and heroes bold, of clashing steel and rousing zeal. The skalds of Gorum chant and sing, and to his halls their tribute bring. So the poems of the Gorum's Kagat are more in line with the Homeric epics or the Poetic Edda, rather than a sonnet, ballad, or villanella. In addition to passing down heroic legends, they also serve a secondary purpose that crosses over into a different form of art, work songs. Each poem of the Gorum's Kagat has a different rhythm to it, easily identified with a simple drum beat. This makes them easy to remember and follow along with. In other words, the perfect marching song. So yes, the Gorum's Kagat is both the Iliad and Yankee Doodle at the same time. The specific rhythm is so important to the Gorum's Kagat that it is preserved throughout every linguistic translation, which can result in some awkward wording in certain tongues like Elven or Dwarvish. Now, just like it lacks a formal holy text, Gorum's church also lacks a formal hierarchy. I find this kind of funny, since you might think a war god church would be structured like a military. But remember, Gorum is also the god of battle, weapons, glory, duels, all individual achievements. Gorum respects and values strength, and as a result, his church is built on the idea of personal accomplishment. The strongest get to be in charge. This means the church tends to favor younger leaders in the prime of their life. There's a saying that I think fits here. There are old adventurers and there are bold adventurers, but there are a few old, bold adventurers. And Gorum very much favors boldness. His stance on oldness is currently under review. So when multiple Gorumite churches congregate together, the first thing they'll do is start brawling for status. These fights are generally not to the death and usually don't cause any lasting harm. The good thing about being a cleric of Gorum is that you have a built-in out to those kinds of accidents. I mean, what's a few kill counts between friendly rivals after all? Hell, it's practically flirting. And Gorum's not super concerned with marriage or family, so he doesn't mind some premarital penetration. I'm not sorry and never will be. These kinds of large-scale meetings are rare, since Gorum doesn't have any established holidays that would encourage such a gathering. Locals might celebrate the dates of a historically important battle, but that's entirely up to them. It's not uncommon for such celebrations to be forgotten over time and eventually phased out. Occasionally, someone will rediscover one of these lost holidays and restart it, usually just as an excuse to party or feast. Then when next year rolls around, no one steps up to organize, and the holiday is lost once more. It's not that Gorumites don't respect history or legacy, rather their focus is on the achievements and glory of the living. Let the dead spend their time on the clashing shore telling tales of old glory. Those who are alive should focus on the here and now. Speaking of right now, what if there isn't a war happening right now? What do Gorum's worshippers do then? Well, there are a few options, the most obvious being find one. If there isn't a war here, go over there where there is a war. Duh! But it's not always that simple. Travel is expensive and not always available. So what are your other options? Well, if a war is about to begin, just keep ready with training, drills, and duels. That's all fine. Alternatively, you can just start your own war. It's usually pretty easy, just grab some friends, find some enemies, and get fighting. It usually snowballs on its own from there. Some people might have reasonable ethical concerns about the geopolitical instability that comes with starting random wars. However, that sounds like politics, which is not our department. If you can't start a war or find one for whatever reason, stuff like monster hunting or mercenary work is an acceptable substitute. Gorumites most often show their devotion to their god through action, which means that art is rare. It makes sense, because war camps don't have a lot of room for like paintings and statues and stuff. What art they do make tends to be temporary or pragmatic. A quick sketch of his figure drawn in blood or hammered together from random scrap is usually what you find. Something a little more creative is sometimes made in temples capable of casting metal for weapons and armor. The forge will have channels for the runoff and slag of the casting process, which will pool into a depression shaped like Gorum's head. As the heated metal is poured, the mold will slowly fill, creating a crude cast of Gorum's helmet. These might look rough, but they are often prized as holy symbols and carried by armies that revere our Lord in Iron. Performance art is the more common expression of worship, with Gorumite skalds being able to perform any of the poems from the Gorum's Kagat on command. These poems are also used as the basis for war chant songs with accompanying sounds that mimic battle, like clashing metal, screaming foes, and breaking bones. Most of the time, magic is used to simulate these last ones, but the more cruel Gorumites will use captured prisoners for a more authentic effect. Now, some people might object to using prisoners for theatrical practical effects, and I'm one of them. Come on, people, that's really messed up. However, so long as it doesn't turn into full-on torture, our Lord in Iron won't explicitly forbid it. Temples to Gorum are almost indistinguishable from fortresses. The clerics there keep the temple ready for a siege at any time, stocked with supplies and weapons. Adventurers looking to get rid of looted items can often sell weapons and armor to a Gorumite temple, where the worshippers will add them to their own armory. They won't buy everything, usually sticking to metal armor and weapons. Magic staves and wands are generally turned away outside of specific circumstances. Outside of the temples, shrines to Gorum are usually very simple. Commonly found at the site of great battles, they're usually just a pile of rocks with a weapon or helmet atop them. I'm sure there's a legend somewhere of a Gorumite stumbling on an old shrine and finding just the weapon they need to defend themselves from whatever it is they're running from. So how does the average person see Gorum? His worshippers are treated with kind of a wary respect by most people. Their strength in battle certainly deserves admiration, but many Gorumites aren't the most stable. They're the kind of people you're happy to have around when a battle is looming, but aren't very helpful during harvest season or tax collection time. People who aren't familiar might also assume that Gorumites are all meat-headed berserkers and bullies, which is not the case. Gorum values strength in every form it takes, not just strength of body, but strength of character and will as well. A bully that backs down at the first sign of opposition is weak, no matter how big their muscles are. Meanwhile, any scrawny kid willing to grab a stick and fight for themselves is considered strong. You can always work on muscle, but proper mindset is harder to teach. Still, the strongest worshippers are often seen as kind of a double-edged sword. It's a bit of a 50-50 shot if they are the violent warmongers the people need to overthrow, versus being the ones that are overthrowing the violent warmongers. Often they're more of a lateral move instead of an improvement. When it comes to other religions, Gorum and his followers are generally neutral. Divine politics are still politics, and Gorum just isn't interested. Other gods see him as a blunt instrument, made to be pointed at enemies and let loose. Some have even tried to trick him into destroying their enemies for them under false pretenses, but that's actually more difficult than you might think. Gorum's not stupid, and the risk of him turning the tables makes that very dangerous. After all, the last thing you need is the god of war teaming up with your mortal enemy to teach you a lesson. He considers other war deities rivals to be conquered. He'll respect some aspects of other gods, like Nethys' strategic intelligence, even if he doesn't care for other parts of their portfolio like all that magic business. Among the core 20, Urgathoa and Norgorber arouse his ire the most. Norgorber is just a murderer, plain and simple. Urgathoa, meanwhile, encourages indulgence and spreads disease through the undead. That weakens living warriors and robs their bodies of the honorable death they earned in combat. This dislike for her can be seen in the only pantheon Gorum is a part of, called the Grave Lady's Guard, which is heavily focused on fighting back the undead. Though many orcs do worship him, he's not a formal member of their pantheon. It's more of a loose association, though as I mentioned earlier, some might honor him as an overarching deity in something of a separate role, though that tends to correlate with the leader of whatever group that is being a devout Gorumite. The spoiler bit. So that's all the main information I wanted to cover, but there is one more thing about Gorum I want to talk about. The rest of the video should be timeless, applicable to Gorum no matter if you're running an adventure set in 4707, the current year of our coverage timeline, 4723, or any year before that or between them. But this current year, 4724, something very impactful happens. It's been all over, but if you absolutely do not want spoilers, skip this section and go to the wrap-up at the timestamp on screen now. So this year, Gorum died, killed by another god. The exact details I'll leave to my coverage of that event later, but it means going forward he no longer grants powers to followers or remains a core Inner Sea god. The ramifications of his death are also too much to get into, and we haven't even really seen them all yet. It can kinda suck learning about a god only to find out they're dead and you can't worship them, but I also think there's a lot of opportunity here. A god dying has happened before, quite a few times actually, but one as old and powerful as this is kind of unprecedented. There's so much storytelling space available to players who go through the loss of their deity. Part of why I wanted to add this was to address why people should care about Gorum, even if in the current canon he's dead. Because this game is part of a living world. Because he mattered to a lot of people who now find themselves without what felt like an eternal cornerstone to their lives. This is who Gorum was. Now ask yourself, will you carry that mantle with you? Or has your faith shattered like his armor? Will you still fight, knowing you could one day die? Because Gorum did, to his last breath. The other reason is that this world is yours as much as it is the developers. I'm going to provide you with information about what is and is not canon, but you can take or leave any of that if you choose. If, in your world, a different god died than Gorum, you're gonna need this information going forward to figure out how Gorum will fit into this new godly war that's going to erupt. So even though he might be canonically gone, it's still important to learn about our Lord in Iron, for both who he was and who he could be if you choose to spare him. Conclusion. And that, my friends, is our Lord in Iron. Gorum seems pretty simple at first glance. He's a war god what likes that fighting stuff real good. But I hope I've shown you the myriad ways that his faithful can interpret that, the nuance to his philosophies. Gorum is simple the way a knife is simple. A functional, practical kind of simple, and one that will cut you deeply if you underestimate it. Thank you so much for watching, Pathfinders. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the core 20 gods of the Inner Sea. Do you have any questions about Gorum? How about ideas for characters based around worshipping him? I'm always a fan of contradictory combinations, so the idea of a Gorum-worshipping sorcerer is really tickling my brain at the moment. If you've made it through the video, please consider checking out the Patreon linked below. I try to get these videos out at least one day early there. I also have a Twitter and Blue Sky account, so please check those out if you haven't. You probably know all the YouTube things to do because you're very smart, but I'll say it anyway, please like, share, and sub to really help the channel out. Now that's enough shilling, it always makes my tongue feel weird when I do it. I've got other scripts to write, so until our next time, Pathfinders, explore, report, and cooperate.